you. Tonight, I hope that we'll experience all AWE. That's seeing God in nature and seeing the creation that He has made gives us an indication of Him. And what I'm going to go through is the highlights of a graduate course that I co-taught with another gentleman. He had his degree in biology, he has doctorate in biology, and I handled more of the physics, chemistry, and mysticism. And so this is going to be very fast. I'm going to try to cover things in principles. The course itself gave more explanations as to how scientists came to discover what they did and the awe that they discovered. And because we've got a lot of ground to cover, I'm going to ask that you write down any questions that you might have, so at the very end of the whole evening, we'll try to get a little time for any questions you might have, so that if I get asked questions while I'm going, it's going to just kind of slow things up and I won't be able to finish. I want to cover some basic assumptions, and you'll notice that if this was a course during a semester, there were probably 14 classes. Now, I'm not going to cover all of them, but that's why you see class 1, okay? And there are certain assumptions that we need to be attentive to. One is faith can never conflict with reason. This is a wonderful teaching of the Catholic Church. It's a heavy subject. I've got to keep my pants from falling off. This is a wonderful teaching because it means that it's not just faith, but it's reason. And they can't conflict with each other. And if our interpretation of one or the other they differ, then either our interpretation of one or the other or both is wrong. Interesting concept. There are agreements. Science can purify religion from error and superstition. Religion can purify science from false absolutes. This is Pope John Paul II. But you may be surprised to see that science without religion is lame, religion without science is blind. Albert Einstein. So there is a sense from both science and faith that they are both needed in some way. But there are different issues, different questions that each asks, and that's why we get confused sometimes when you're here in the secular world. The question that's asked by faith is why. Science asks the question how. Language in faith is silence. We talked about silent prayer, how God speaks to us in the silence. In science, it's math. The scope is faith is everything. For science, it's the material world. And the issue of history, faith is millennia. It's since the beginning of time. Science has done most of its work recently, so it's fairly new to the picture. Miracles in nature. This is an important subject because sometimes we get confused. We think that a miracle is a violation of the laws of nature. Well, St. Augustine said, miracles are not contrary to nature, but only contrary to what we know about nature. So I hope that as we go through this, you'll come to appreciate the fact that the real miracle is creation itself. Why would God want to take an exception to His own miracle to create a miracle? The miracle is creation itself. Amen. And so don't go looking for things that violate the laws of nature, although we may see things that we think violate the law, but they really quite often are things that are indicative of us not understanding the laws of nature completely. There are going to be 4 major themes: physics to metaphysics, chemistry to life, biology to consciousness, and psychology to mysticism. And I'll try to identify that as we go through. Physics to metaphysics is the first that we're going to talk about. In the class 2, we talked about matter and energy. And to talk about matter and energy, and I'm going to give this presentation in a way that non-scientists can understand it, so don't be fearful. How many here have been trained in science or engineering? Okay, so don't worry, the rest of you don't worry, we're going to cover this in ways that I think can be understood, okay? When we're talking about the universe, it's usually measured in the speed of light, and because the distances are so great. The speed of light is 186,000 miles per second. To give you an idea, it takes about 8 minutes for the light from the sun to reach the Earth. A light year is 5.9 times 10 to the 12 miles. Now, 10 to the 12 is a scientific notation that just merely means that there are 12 zeros after that, those numbers, okay? Which is really, if you want to remember a light year, it's 5.9 trillion miles. It's the distance that light travels in 1 year, which is 5.9 trillion miles. Unbelievable. Pack that away. Hold on to it. We're going to go for a ride. Now, this is our solar system, the sun and all of the planets, etc., and the moon around the Earth. Usually I give a whole series of slides for this. But basically, we have just a solar system of our own. But our solar system is part of the Milky Way galaxy. And we exist right here on the tip of the tail. So if you go out in the countryside and you look at the stars in the Milky Way, what you're looking at is actually the tail of our galaxy. And Orion and some of these others are constellations of stars that form certain patterns, and you can look at them. Orion is one of the ones that most of us can probably see, but we don't see these in the city because the lights block it. Well, that's the Milky Way galaxy. Well, it contains 200 billion stars, 100,000 light years across. That's 100,000 times 5.9 trillion. 5.9 trillion times 100,000. That's how many miles across our galaxy is. This is mind-boggling. Now, if you held a dime up like this into the night sky with a telescope, you would see this. Those are other galaxies. These are not stars, these are galaxies. It's astounding how many galaxies there are. How many are there? There are 100 billion galaxies like our galaxy. 200 billion stars per galaxy. Now that estimate varies all over the map. But at 200 billion stars per galaxy, you're looking at 20 billion trillion stars in the universe. It is gigantic. It is beyond our imagination. But all that stuff that I just talked about is really only 4% of the universe. All of those stars, all of those galaxies is only 4% of the universe. The other 96% is made up of dark matter and dark energy. So these are, for example, black holes are included in there. So here we can't even imagine the magnitude of the universe, and yet what we see or able to see is only 4% of it. The rest is dark energy and dark matter. Now, in class 3, we talked about the Big Bang. Basically, where did all this universe come from? Okay. Now, if we think in terms of faith and science, that first class gives us a sense of the power of God, the magnitude of His power. If His power is that great, can you imagine the power and magnitude of His love? It's beyond our imagination. But then the Big Bang theory comes along and we say, where did it come from? Well, there's a general theory of relativity by Einstein, which is best described by these two drawings. Now, in a spherical Earth, can you imagine back, in fact, there still is a flat Earth society, believe it or not. There are people that actually still believe in the flat Earth. But you walk around the Earth, and you don't fall off, right? Well, the general theory of relativity by Einstein said that space and time are curved. So that if we're inside the universe and we walk one direction, we come back the other direction. So the question that some people will say is, what's outside the universe? That is a nonsensical question. That's the equivalent of saying, when I fall off the earth, where do I go?
Amen.
So saying what's outside the universe is a nonsensical question, because if we say what's outside the universe, we say, well, this is the universe. So by our physics, it's curved. Space and time is curved.
Yes.
Now, obviously, going around the universe like that would be a long walk. So basically, Einstein was searching for a theory that would combine all of the forces. And at the time that he was trying to do this, he only knew of two forces. Electromagnetic energy, which is the sun, it's the electricity, okay? Infrared, you can go through a whole series. Radar, X-rays, and the second energy was gravity. He only knew those two, and he tried to come up with an equation that would sum those. And the equation basically said that the universe is expanding and that it started at a point. Now, this was contrary to the paradigm that Einstein had in his mind. And what challenges scientists is to always think outside the paradigm. And Einstein was brilliant. He thought outside the paradigm and came up with a curved universe. But even he was susceptible to the paradigm. And so he said, well, that's not sensical. I'm going to have to add a factor. In science, we call it a fudge factor, to prevent the universe from just expanding. Lemaitre, Father Lemaitre, a Catholic priest, went to see Einstein and convinced him that his original equation was correct, that the universe actually did start from a beginning. Isn't that amazing? See where we're heading to faith here? Now, Lemaitre was a physicist, and he didn't approach it from a faith standpoint. He was approaching it from a scientific standpoint, and he was saying to Einstein, your equation was right. Do not add a fudge factor. And so the universe started at a point, and scientists call it the singularity. Now, once it started, it expanded rapidly, not in a cone fashion, but in a massive explosion at the beginning, and then tapered out. And over 13.7 billion years, which is considered the age of the universe, you were getting things formed. In the beginning, mostly molecular, but then as you moved out, galaxies, planets, dark energy, etc. Scientists, up until not too long ago, thought that the point at which the universe started was the size of a baseball. Then they came to realize it was the size of a golf ball. Then they realized that it was a point that had no dimension, no length, width, or depth. Let me say that again. It was a singularity, is what they called it, with no length, width, or depth. What is that translated into? That means it's outside space. Because it was so massive and there was no light, we need light to have time. So it was outside time. So the singularity was outside space and time. Our universe came from outside space and time. Isn't that the way we think of God? Outside space and time. this affects how we think in terms of our faith, too. So when somebody says we're going to spend an eternity in hell or an eternity in heaven, that is, in a sense, a nonsensical question. Because those are, I can't even say those places. It's this outside space and time. So what does that mean? So when you hear those terms used, it's usually an effort to use our human experience to describe something that is indescribable. It's beyond words. So the universe is 13.7 billion years old, roughly. And the light year, it's 5.9 trillion miles. It would take about 156 billion light years to traverse the universe. Now, traverse, what does that mean?
Travel.
And the reason it's more than 13.7 is because the universe is expanding at an accelerating rate. This is not cruise control in your car. This is when you're pushing the pedal to the metal further and further and further and further and further. So it's going faster, faster, faster. This is mind-boggling. The four forces that Einstein knew about were these two. These are the other two that came about and were learned about after Einstein. These are the strong nuclear force, which holds together the atoms, and the weak, which allows some energy particles to escape to maintain stability. And their relative proportions are here. So if you define weak nuclear force as 1, the strong is 1,000 times greater. Electromagnetic is 100 times greater. But here's the interesting thing. The very first energy source to be discovered was gravity. And yet, it was 10 to the minus 39 smaller. That's 0.0000039 zeros. It's minute. But at the point of that singularity, it gets very big because it's very tightly bound together. I don't want to get into the math and all that. So the four forces become very important at this singularity. The singularity was dimensionless, perfectly ordered, and I won't get into that too much, but in thermodynamics, there's a thing called entropy, which is a measure of disorder. And the second law of thermodynamics says that entropy has to always increase. Okay, there's always more and more disorder. Now I'll get into why human beings are not disordered. We sit here, we're pretty organized looking. I mean, we got a head, we got 2 eyes, there's a reason for that. Oh, it looks like a violation of the second law, but it isn't. But guess what entropy was at the moment of that singularity? It was 0. The universe was perfectly ordered outside space and time at the singularity. Does this sound something like God? I'm not saying the singularity is God. I'm just saying, wow, this was our origin. The forces were unified. This was the unified theory that Einstein was looking for. And we had a big bang outside space and time. Now we're going to chemistry to life. This is the DNA molecule, artist rendering, looking down the center of the DNA molecule. We're going to talk a little bit about the chemistry to life, first with quantum and thermo. Now, those are big words. You're going to go, why is he talking about this at RCIA? Well, just try to hang with me, okay? Hang with me. Here's a life timeline. The Earth was formed 4.5 billion years ago. Now remember, the universe is 13.7 billion. So the Earth is kind of new to the scene. 3 billion years ago, one-cell fossils were found that document that. Then around 543 million, the Cambrian explosion took place. And usually I explain the Cambrian explosion later, but I'll tell you right now what that means. We talk, usually it's during the evolutionary presentation, but the Cambrian explosion happened very narrow period of time, almost overnight in geologic time. Humans, the animal life developed 2 eyes, 2 ears, 2 noses, 2 ears, 2 nostrils, etc. It was an amazing thing that happened across different phyla, different species. And they can't quite explain why this was an explosion of change that was kind of outside of the normal evolutionary pattern that you would think of. Dinosaurs became extinct at 65 million years. Primitive apes were around 27 million years ago. Hominids appeared around 6 million years ago. Now, hominids were the step right before humans. If you take 6 million years and divide it by 13.7 billion, the age of the universe, and you make the analogy to a 24-hour clock, we humans were on the verge of coming about in the last 38 seconds of a 24-hour clock. We ain't been here very long. Isn't this stunning? God's been working at this for a while, okay? But we were not an afterthought, and I'll get to that in a minute. We were not an afterthought because of the anthropic principle. Now, the anthropic principle is an analysis of the 4 forces and how they were balanced at the point of the singularity. They were so balanced as to make life possible. So, in a faith basis, God had in mind, and I've seen physicists write about this that almost aren't even religious, that life was destined to happen just based on the balance of those 4 forces at the singularity. Now, I realize this is going to be mathematical, but I'll try to go through it. If the gravitational force were less than the electromagnetic force by just a small percentage, there would be no stars, and the ones that were there would be small and they'd burn out. And we need light for life. If the weak nuclear force was a little bit less than the strong nuclear force, remember those 4 forces? By just a small percent, there would be no water. Hydrogen to helium would go to helium. There would be no water. Without water, there's no life. If the strong nuclear force were just greater by 2%, there would be no protons and no atoms. If the weak nuclear force were less than 5%, smaller by 5%, there would be no stars. And if the ratio of the strong nuclear force to the electromagnetic energy were greater than or were less than or greater than by a small percentage, in other words, if they moved either bigger or smaller by just a small percentage, there would be no carbon, and our bodies are made up of carbon. So, at the moment of the singularity, our lives were destined. It was as if God were saying, "I'm creating this universe for you, even though you won't appear until the last fraction of a second of the 24-hour clock." A-W-E, awe. Okay? Just awe. Traveling observer in the universe. I'm going to skip this. Now, scientists thought they were pretty smart. They knew that there was a belief in science in the first part of the 1900s that if you couldn't measure it, it didn't exist. Well, they came to find out that the electron flying around an atom, around a nucleus, its location couldn't be determined. Wow. Well, does that mean it doesn't exist? No, that's not true. It does exist. So they started to adopt probability theory as a way of proving science. It no longer had to be measurable. It could be just, say, a greater likelihood of being in a certain area than another area. And so this color coding implies a higher probability in certain areas than other areas that the electron is rotating, is in a cloud around the atom. The principle here is not technical. The principle here is suddenly scientists started to realize that they couldn't know. And Heisenberg uncertainty principle was born. Werner Heisenberg wrote his uncertainty paper in 1927. And here is what it was. The more precisely the electron position is determined, the less precisely the momentum is known, and vice versa. What this principle states is that nature, by its very nature, that's a dumb way of putting it, but by its very nature is impossible to know. Scientists believe this. Suddenly, no longer was it, if we can't measure it, it doesn't exist. Now they're saying that what we're studying in the universe, by its very nature, cannot be known totally. Faith-wise, who are we talking about? God cannot be known completely. Science doesn't have a problem not knowing something completely now. They did before. God is the ultimate determiner of the indeterminacies at the quantum level. Ian Barber wrote a wonderful book, and basically what he was saying is that at the molecular level, if you think that God can create miracles by not violating nature, the laws of nature, the place for him to do it is in the uncertainty at the quantum level. He could enter the picture and we wouldn't know the difference. Isn't that an interesting thought? Scientifically, he could enter the picture and we couldn't measure it. This is an interesting concept. This blew scientists, blew their minds. It's called the quantum entanglement. When you take a calcium atom and you bombard it with photons, electromagnetic energy, what happens is there's a pair of photons that blows off from the calcium atom, and those paired photons have the same spin. And what they noticed, scientists noticed, is it seemed like if they changed the spin of one, the other changed. So they thought, well, this is kind of odd. Maybe they're talking to each other. So they decided to put together an experiment and shoot these photons off in two different directions at 12 kilometers, about 7 miles distance. And they changed the spin on one. Instantaneously, the other one changed. I'm not talking about the speed of light between the two. I'm talking about instantaneously. And because of the relative size of the photon compared to 7 miles, this distance could have been just as easily across the whole universe. What they came up with was a scientific basis that scientists accept now, and that is the non-local universe. I like to think of it as the other side of the coin, and that is the all-local universe. In other words, things can happen on one end of that universe and instantly happen on the other end. Do we think of God as being omnipresent? And if we think that's hard to swallow, why are the scientists having no problem swallowing this? The world is all local. I like to describe it both ways. They call it the non-local universe, but it's like a coin. You can say one side of the coin is the non-local universe, the other side is it's all local. God's got us. He's got us. Life is organized. Doesn't that violate the second law of thermodynamics? It apparently violates the second law. Well, along comes Brignoni. I don't have his name here, I don't know what happened. He won the Nobel Prize for dissipative structures. A dissipative system is a thermodynamically open system which is operating out of and often far from the thermodynamic equilibrium in an environment with which it exchanges energy. Don't worry about the words. Complicated. What he's saying is that certain things appear to violate the second law of thermodynamics, but they really don't. Two examples. See, I took some slides out because I had to get through this. One example is whirlpools. That's organized. Why should that be organized? It should violate the second law. Human beings actually contribute to more disorder in the universe, even though we are not ordered, even though we are ordered. So we eat corn, potatoes, organized food, and we discharge feces, which is disorganized. So our total contribution is adding to the disorganization of the universe, but yet we are not disorganized.
Right.
Interesting, isn't it? Somehow God's got us here organized. The world may get chaotic, but we're okay. So then the word chaos comes up, and chaos theory. So, you've heard of chaos. I mean, you know, that's chaotic, it's all screwed up, we can't figure it out. Well, chaos theory is not chaotic. Chaos is not chaotic. So, what happened is, who discovered this? Well, scientists were utilizing the newly discovered power of computers, and the first test of this magnificent computing capacity was to solve some of the biggest problems there are that contribute to one of the biggest costs in our community, and that's weather prediction. People are losing crops, and so if you can predict weather, you're okay. So these scientists put together in the computers input at night. The next day they go to get the results, and the results make no sense. Because that's what scientists do. They look at the results and they go, well, if it doesn't make any sense, something's screwed up. I mean, you know. They discovered that they had put in a slightly wrong number, and overnight it started to get worse and worse and worse. So they discovered what is called chaos theory, which means that if you change one little variable, you change everything. But that there are so many variables that there's no way that we can ever account for all of them in the universe. But in a simple problem that they had, they discovered that it's a very important thing. And so what they did is they came up with a term to describe chaos theory called the butterfly effect. What they said was, and again they're studying weather, is if a butterfly flaps its wings in Beijing, it will change the weather in New York. If a butterfly flaps its wings in Beijing, what they were saying is it just takes a little bit and things change. And it's a true statement. So chaos is not chaotic, and graphing chaos is an interesting exercise. What could it tell us? Well, they graphed it and they came up with Mandelbrot fractals. And they thought chaos was chaotic, but chaos is not chaotic. You can't quite see it here, but this is a plot of the randomness, what appear to be randomness, but what really isn't, of chaos. And basically the overall pattern is repeated in a smaller pattern is repeated in a tinier pattern. So if you had a microscope and you kept zeroing in, you would see the same pattern that you see in the gross. Now what does this tell us? God's got his act together. I don't know. They can't study this, it's too complicated, because there are too many variables. But what it's telling us is we thought disorganization or chaos was chaotic, and it really isn't. And of course, light travels. And so if you look at these galaxies far away, the faint red objects are massive galaxies, greater than 10 billion light years away. So what we are actually viewing is we're viewing these galaxies as they existed 10 billion years ago. We can look back in the past 10 billion years. Unbelievable. Can we look to the future? There are several reasons why we can't. Thermodynamics causes which disorder of the entropy increases. The cosmological arrow, psychologically we can't conceive of it. I'm not going to get into this in detail, but basically science has shown we can look back to the past, but not the future. Subatomic molecules. Now we're to chemistry to life, okay, second phase. And this is the Hadron Collider in Switzerland. Remember they were going to build it in Texas and they ran out of money? Or they didn't want to spend it? Well, this is the inside of the tube, and this is the circle of that tube. And basically, without a lot of slides, how am I doing time-wise? Wow. Well, without a lot of slides, basically, you know how an electric motor works? There's a positive and negative, and they keep flipping positive, negative, and the magnets keep pushing, pull, push, pull, push, pull, until the engine starts moving. Well, they do this in a linear way with magnets, and they keep saying push, pull, push, pull, push, pull, and they start accelerating a particle, looking for the God particle. Now, I must tell you, the Higgs boson is what they call the God particle. Guess what? That term was a joke amongst the scientists. And theologians or fundamentalists, who knows, started to take this seriously. It's not serious. They took it as a joke because they were looking for this ultimate particle. The God particle is euphemistically named. Peter Higgs predicted it. Particle characteristic carries 4 forces, and they discovered it during the class I was teaching. I had to change the slide. Watson Crick discovered the DNA helix. I remember when this was discovered. That shows how old I am. But I couldn't believe it, that it would be such a complex molecule and yet carried a total map of each person. So every cell in your body has a complete map of you totally. Now, let's talk about faith, the body of Christ. Everybody in this room is part of the body of Christ. Each one of us contains the full presence of Christ in us,
Yes.
just as much as the group does.
Yes.
Is there awe here? I'm looking for awe. Gotta have awe, okay? And the DNA molecule, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but you think this is simple. It's not. It contains a complete code for the whole body. It has 4,600 trillion DNA molecules per human body, 2 meters long DNA molecules per cell. The DNA is 2 meters long, 6.5 feet long. That's 3 times 10 to the minus 5 meter average cell diameter. So it's a very tiny cell, and you got 6 foot of this stuff. So the ratio of the DNA to the compression of that cell size is 100,000 to 1. You've taken that DNA and you've shrunk, you've crammed it into this little cell. It's beyond the imagination. I won't go into this other stuff. Okay, so anyway, the Cambrian explosion, I kind of covered that earlier, but it basically happened more in the depths of the ocean than anything else. Life chemistry, unknown. Science thinks they got certain parts of it, but they really don't know. Atoms to Earth, dying stars, pretty much accepted. Hydrogen and carbon going to amino acids, atmospheric and geologic effects, pretty much a possibility. Amino acids to proteins, could be clay templates. There's in the clay they would form and start matching up. But the rest of it is unknown. How it got to cells, science doesn't know. This is usually a break point, but I think we ought to just keep rolling. Biology to consciousness. It gets more interesting. It's just stunningly interesting. Evolutionary theory. Now, as Catholics, we believe evolutionary theory does not violate Scripture, and when it comes to interpreting Genesis, you can't take that literally. God is creating on an ongoing basis. So, Darwin's theory, evolutionary theory, was variability. Some forms are better adapted than others. Adaptation fitness. Those forms that are better adapted will leave more offspring and thus increase in population. And natural selection is environments change. Some new form may become better adapted and increase in frequency. That is, new species may come. Now, we are not descendants from apes. Okay, forget that. Whenever you hear that, just forget it. We have some common ancestors, but ultimately, there was a moment when God gave us that gift of consciousness and conscience. And that was the moment of Adam. I'm not going to go through all of this, but basically that the common ancestors we talk about here a little bit, okay, in this graph. And a little bit here too. I don't want to go into all of it, but there were some common ancestors. And the migration is interesting, going from Africa, and they've traced these migrations through DNA studies. Even today, they look at people's DNA from different parts of the world. They can track where it probably where we migrated, where it started in Africa. Okay, I'm not going to go into all of that. Now, this is a Catholic priest, Teilhard de Chardin. He was a paleontologist, and I remember reading him when I was young. I just was fascinated by him. He was way ahead of his time. Basically, the most telling and profound way of describing the evolution of the universe will undoubtedly be traced the evolution of love. There is almost a sensual longing for communion with others who have a large vision. The immense fulfillment of the friendship between those engaged in furthering the evolution of consciousness has a quality impossible to describe. In other words, what he was saying is that we are evolving toward God without ever becoming God, because God is drawing us. And this consciousness, you can see we're in a very big revolution right now in terms of the internet. Something happens in one part of the world, we know right away there's some problems in another part of the world, we pray for the people. So there's this movement in that direction. Now, conscience and consciousness, I'm not going to cover because we talked a little bit about this. Remember Phineas Gage and Michael May when we talked about moral theology? So I'm not going to go into that. But obviously the brain and its function plays a big role in culpability. Okay? Medicine and healing. This part of the course was taught by a friend of mine who's an Episcopal priest. He's got his MD degree and his doctorate in ministry. And obviously he did a marvelous job. I can't do nearly as well as he did. But I'll just mention that there is a handbook of religion and health that documents pretty much a compendium of all the research on faith and religion. And the Institute for Spirituality and Health, which he's the president of and I'm vice chairman, The mission is to increase awareness of the role that spirituality plays in healing, in coping with chronic illness, and in maintaining spiritual health. So this is going on here in Houston. It's 59 years old. It's the oldest organization that I'm aware of in the country. And so Herbert Benson, who's out of Harvard, has done a lot of research on meditation practice. Decreases metabolism, decreases the heart rate, decreases rate of breathing, slower brain waves, reduces chronic pain, helps with insomnia, helps with anxiety and hostility, lessens depression, helps with premenstrual syndrome, helps with infertility. These are scientific studies. What we practice in centering prayer has shown these results. Because the body and the soul are interstitial, according to Catholic teaching. So there should be some sort of a cross effect. These were from hospice patients, and there is an increased life satisfaction, increased happiness, and a diminished pain for those who have a belief system. Pain management is rather interesting. Most people think, well, it's just pain pills. But actually, this was a survey of people who manage pain in different ways. And 76% of them were prayer, 66 meditation, etc. So there are scientific studies and bases for prayer and belief systems. The courses on teaching on spirituality and health, to combine the two for medical doctors in the country, is increasing. In 1990, there was only 3% of schools with such courses. Now it's 72%. So there's an increased awareness of the role of spirituality in healing. Let me look at this slide number here. I'm running ahead of time a little bit. I think we can take a break. Yeah, so why don't we take a break of 10 minutes?
Right.
Okay, how about 10 minutes, okay? 10 minutes.
Just a few announcements as usual. Congratulations to everyone catechumens who are now called elect.
Okay. Thank you. Fertility rate is the number of births per woman, and no culture has survived at a fertility rate of less than 1.9. Now the U.S. is 2.1 with immigration, but I just came from Italy, gave this presentation, and they were a bit surprised to see that Italy is at 1.2. So cultures that have this concept of this culture of death die out. Nature has a way of regulating these bad ideas, and the people don't survive, which is consistent. I'm not going to get into this. This is also some studies on gay marriage. Psychology to mysticism. This is the last section. We're going to talk about meditation and mystics on one class. The Desert Fathers and Mothers in Egypt in the 4th century were interviewed by John Cassian, and they were the first monks and nuns. And in his interviews, he wrote a book called The Conferences, which is the longest work in Christian antiquity. And in it says, the mind rejects the whole wealth and abundance of thoughts. The soul then pours out to God wordless prayers. Now you're going to see century prayer in this, which I taught you. Keep that in mind as we go through this. And then the thoughts that come, ordinary imagination thoughts when you're practicing centering prayer, and you have thoughts coming, you're going to have ordinary thoughts that come. Did I turn the automobile lights out? That person really makes me angry. Now I understand the Trinity better. I am not doing so well at the centering prayer. I picked the wrong sacred word, whatever. are unloading of the unconscious. Now, I just gave a presentation, organized a panel, just gave a presentation in Chicago at the Medicine and Religion Conference about how healing can take place through meditation because of these unconscious thoughts. And I taught this to some veterans, war veterans, and one of them came back to me as an example. And he said to me, I asked how it's going, and he said, well, I started to dream at night what really happened to me in Vietnam. I said, what did you do then? He said, well, then during the day I became fully aware. And then I said, what did you do then? And he said, I ever so gently let it go and returned to God. Now, he was a PTSD patient, and I told this to the head of the psychiatric department of Baylor. He was stunned because they're having trouble treating PTSD patients. So the mind and prayer can play a role in our healing process, and science knows this. Fruits of the prayer can be love, peace, patience, unloading of the unconscious. The most common one is the sense of peace. And the physical effects, lower blood pressure, less melancholy, less suffering, less nervousness, etc. Before I have surgery, I practice centering prayer. The nurse takes my blood pressure. It's usually 130/110. 20 minutes later, I ask her to take it again. She said, why? I said, well, just take it if you would. And it's usually 80/40, somewhere in that range. And then she looks at me like, what the heck happened? Well, it's because I was praying. Okay. I've had this, I mentioned the Vietnam veteran. I've had chemo patients that have shown tremendous peace. A young male teenager couldn't feel his hands, his ecstasy. It's a form of a contemplative gift, which is unusual. We take it to penitentiaries, battered women's shelters, etc. So there is a healing process in that. And the spiritual effects are wisdom, patience, peace, kindness, etc. But again, peace is usually the one that's most common. So there is a quotable agreement on this subject. Our contemplation of Him, God, is a participation in His contemplation of Himself. And this is Thomas Merton, the Trappist, who's passed away, but I was at Gethsemane when he was there. Never met him, unfortunately. And then the most beautiful emotion we can experience is the mystical. What do you think said that? Albert Einstein. Rather interesting. So, psychotherapy and spirituality, I'm not going to get into this too much because I had a brilliant psychotherapist, psychologist rather, who taught this class. But forgiveness has been shown to be tremendously healing. It can be individuals, families, nations, biology, and evolution are all subjects that have been studied. And religion is important in the U.S. it's about 90% important, but among psychiatrists it's 56%. So going to a psychiatrist, you've got to be very careful on who you choose because their belief system is not as high as the normal population. U.S. is 96%. Among psychiatrists believing in God, it's much less. Afterlife belief, U.S. 71%, 48% among psychiatrists. And talk spirituality, very few psychiatrists will talk about it. That's why you need a spiritual director with a psychiatrist. Religious survey, 68% believe in angels and demons, 59% believe in hell, 58% pray daily, 57% believe that theists believing in God is necessary for morals and values, 48% attend religious services in the past week, etc. And this is a rather interesting study. If you go to church regularly, regardless of your belief system, your life expectancy is 7 years longer. And amongst African Americans, it's 14 years longer. There's less stress and it goes through kind of the similar things that you experience in this prayer practice that we were talking about. But not many people realize that there have been scientific studies to show that attendance at church increases your life expectancy dramatically. Neuroscience and neurotheology. Now, this was one of the presentations I gave in Rome when I just came back from Rome. And I'm going to just cover a little bit of it because I think this is the frontier of science, and you're going to start to see the wrap from the physics to this and to spirituality, I think. There were a lot of people who talked about consciousness. St. Aquinas was the first to talk about the unconscious, and there were a whole bunch of people that studied it over the centuries talking about it. I'm not going to get into all of it, okay? They tried to measure it, there was a real recognition that there was an unconscious going on. Now, I've never seen this comparison, but this gives a sense of the magnitude of the brain and the universe, and I compared the two. The universe has got 100 billion galaxies. There are 100 billion cells in the brain. There are 200 billion stars per galaxies. There are 1 billion neurons or nerves in the brain. 20 billion trillion stars, 100,000 dendrites per neuron. 14 billion light years, 100 trillion dendrites, etc. But the key here that I wanted to show is, remember the visible universe, 4%? And the 96% is the invisible. The brain is only 5% conscious, and it's 95% unconscious.
Amen.
So, what's going on? The 5% of the brain that's conscious makes these conscious decisions for showing up here tonight. The unconscious gives us the ability to breathe without thinking about it. And this is the fascinating part about the brain. Science is on the frontier of studying the brain. Brain has dualities. It has right-left hemispheres, present and future, ability to reason, present and future, multi-stable stimulus, emotion and reason, conscious and unconscious. Now, I'm going to go through each of these very quickly, but I want to give you a sense of the brain and how incredibly beautiful it is and its magnitude. I'm going to talk about this first duality of emotion and reason. Emotion is very fast, reason is slow. Emotion is automatic, reason is very systematic. Emotion is implicit, reason is explicit. Emotion is heuristic, which means it kind of understands things without the details. Reason is analytic, intuitive, rule-based, reactive, proactive, impulsive, reflexive. And here is where it gets interesting. It's the oldest part of the brain for the emotion, and the youngest part is reason. You think about Adam and Eve, that's where we got this youngest part. And it's in the different parts of the brain, the limbic and the neocortex. So the emotion is in the unconscious, the reason is in the conscious. Now, the best way I've seen looking at this is to think of conscious mind as the chief executive officer of a company and the problem solver. And the unconscious, implicit workers, like normal breathing. So the workers are making widgets, and the CEO doesn't know how to make widgets, but the workers know how to do it. And then the widget machine breaks down, and the workers go to the CEO and say, the widget machine broke down, we got to fix it. Then the CEO kicks in the conscious mind and starts working on it. Now, the question is, what do we know about what makes an animal conscious? And how can we measure that? Well, humans are fully conscious, they have full consciousness and unconsciousness and conscience. We talked about that before. And animals have some semblance of that, but not very much.
Right.
One of the tests in this is the rat test. They put some food in front of a rat, and they'll put electric charge on it. So the rat goes up, and he tries to eat the food, it gets shocked, it comes back, and then it rocks forward, and then it rocks back, and it rocks forward, rocks back, and it becomes catatonic, it freezes, because the conscious mind of a rat isn't able to solve the dilemma of, do I eat to live, or do I not eat to live? So, not all animals have this. There are different states of consciousness: wakefulness, REM sleep, rapid eye movement, non-REM sleep. And near-death experiences tend to happen between wakefulness and REM. That's what the scientists believe, which happens to be where contemplative experiences from prayer can happen. Near-death categories: cognitive timelessness, affective peace, paranormal, out-of-body experiences, transcendental, angels, the divine. Remember the singularity? Are we attuned to creation? I'm not going to go through the details of this, but different parts of the brain are identifiable for assessing different parts of God in terms of intellectual, identifying God, etc. So I'm not going to go through this. Now, the relational prayer that we've mentioned before is discursive, cataphatic, and contemplative apophatic. Contemplative is without words. We've practiced that already, okay? And we're going to, and there have been studies on centering prayer, what I taught you, on Franciscan nuns. And this was done by Adam Newberg. I met him here in Houston, wrote a book on this general subject. And those nuns who prayed had larger parietal lobes and also frontal lobes. They subsequently realized that the brain is neuroplastic. It changes. So just like Einstein had to be corrected that the universe was expanding, so the brain was thought to be static by psychiatrists and neuroscientists. Now they realize that it can be changed, and the biggest way it can be changed is through prayer. Now, I want to talk about how this relates to our spirituality. Okay? Because we went through a lot of science. One of the things that science has proven is the existence of original sin. And it's proven it through studies on confirmation bias. Now, we talked about confirmation bias. That is, the human beings as we as human beings are known to only take in and take into consideration data that reaffirms our preconceived ideas. And so that's really original sin. And I have a problem with original sin as a word. I think it's a bit of a misnomer, because it's not that that baby sinned, it's that that baby now has the ability to choose when it gets older between good and evil. And so that gift of good and evil, of being able to choose good and evil, gives us the ability to worship God freely, not as automatons. And so that freedom to worship is sometimes called original sin, because we can also choose evil. But we have a tendency to just incorporate the data that we know will reinforce our preconceived ideas. The only way to break that is to get into the unconscious mind through prayer. Now, we can learn in the unconscious. I didn't talk to you about the chicken sexers, did I? I think you would have remembered. In the chicken industry, when the chicks are born, they don't want to feed the male chicks because they're not economically valuable.
Right, it's true.
Guys, I'm sorry. It's kind of the way it is.
Brain dead.
Women, I think, know this already somehow. So they have to determine as early as possible because they don't want to be feeding them until they get old enough to be able to determine whether they're male or female.
Yeah.
So they discovered that some Japanese were able to make this determination very early. So they went over and studied the Japanese. They asked them, how are you doing it? And they said, we don't know. Well, what do you mean you don't know? You're taking the chick, you're looking at them, you're putting one in this bin and one in that bin, and they're getting them right. Well, we don't know. So they studied them and they practiced with them, came home, and they could do the same thing. And when they were asked, how do you do it? They said, we don't know. And so they can learn through the unconscious. And through prayer, that unconscious opens up to us. Now, neurosurgeons and neuroscientists believe the unconscious is totally in the brain. But even Alexander wrote a book that was on the bestseller list called Proof of Heaven. If you get a chance to read it. He was in town here while I was in Rome. I missed him. I wanted to attend his talk. He now believes, because of his experience, you have an E. coli infection, which shuts the brain down completely, and his neurosurgical knowledge told him that meant the brain was totally shut down. All these reasons that some scientists came up with for why you have near-death experiences were completely bogus in his case, and yet he had dramatic near-death experiences. His belief now, his worldview's changed. His belief now is that the brain is a filter for consciousness, and consciousness is outside the brain. And that God influences us, and I'm adding this, God influences us in the unconscious and delves in. And so the wavelengths in the brain, and there are 4 major electromagnetic wavelengths in the brain. One of them is associated with contemplative prayer, which I taught you. And it's also the same wavelength that is often associated with near-death experiences. So I taught centering prayer to 10 people one time, not too long ago, and of the 10, 3 of them had had pleasant near-death experiences in their lives. I didn't know that, except for one. I knew one of them. And during their first 20-minute practice of the prayer, they all 3 relived their near-death experience and started to talk to each other. We have no idea how much God loves us and teaches us without our full awareness. Without our full awareness. But science is realizing that it's much bigger than we thought, which is the same thing that science struggled with in the universe. And so the brain is neuroplastic. God is able to speak to us through the unconscious and the conscious. I'm not suggesting that it doesn't bubble up from the unconscious to the conscious on occasion. These are the experiences of experiencing God's presence. But I'm convinced that there is an equivalent Heisenberg uncertainty principle for the unconscious mind that there is for the electrons, in the sense that we will never know it completely, because that's where God dwells and deals with us and dabbles with us. One of the priests that I met over in Rome is going to write a book, and he said, I'm going to call it Hide and Seek of God. And in a way, that's true.
Yeah.
God kind of hides and seeks.
It's true.
He seeks us, and then he kind of goes back. He's basically calling us. So, any questions